Eleanor Hart had always found solace in the kitchen. The clatter of pans, the slow simmer of stew on the stove, and the scent of fresh herbs were not just reminders of her southern roots, but also of a time when her family held each meal sacred. Her small house in rural Georgia still smelled of sweet tea and peach cobbler, a memory of her late husband Thomas, who once called her cooking the taste of home. Now, at 60, Eleanor found herself standing in her modest kitchen, spooning creamy mashed potatoes into a porcelain bowl, garnishing them with a pat of butter that slowly melted into golden pools. She had spent the entire day preparing dinner for her son Marshall, his wife Kristen, and their teenage daughter Leela. It had become increasingly rare for them to visit, so Eleanor poured her heart into the food, thinking that perhaps a taste of the past might rekindle the warmth that had slowly faded from their relationships. She made cornbread the way her mother taught her, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside. The collard greens had stewed for hours with smoked turkey legs, and she had just taken out the cobbler, letting it rest as its buttery crust crackled from the oven's final heat. When they arrived, Marshall gave her a brief hug, his arms stiff and perfunctory. Kristen barely looked up from her phone, murmuring something about how busy her week had been, and Lila sat down at the table, earbuds still in, her eyes glued to her tablet. Eleanor tried to brush off the disappointment. She served the food with care, placing each dish gently on the table, hoping it would be enough to spark conversation, to bring a little joy to the evening. Wow, Kristen said, pushing the greens around on her plate with a fork. This looks old. Marshall chuckled, reaching for the cornbread. You know, Mom hasn't changed a thing since we were kids. It's like stepping into a food museum, Kristen added with a smirk. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she poured sweet tea into their glasses. She said nothing, only smiled faintly and took her seat. She tried to steer the conversation toward Leela's school, asking what subjects she liked best, but the teenager barely lifted her eyes. It's fine, she mumbled, stuffing a piece of cobbler into her mouth before pushing her plate away. Midway through dinner, Marshall's phone buzzed. He picked it up and laughed. Oh man, you've got to see this, he said, turning the screen toward Kristen. Remember that vegan cafe we went to last weekend? They just posted a reel of their black garlic noodles. Now that's what real food looks like. Kristen leaned over, giggling. Right, it's all about innovation these days, not gravy and beans. Eleanor's heart clenched. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, the food now tasting bland and cold in her mouth. She had imagined tonight differently, perhaps laughter over the cobbler, stories from Lila about her dreams, even a simple thank you from Marshall. Instead, she felt like a ghost in her own home, her years of love and labor dismissed like a soggy biscuit. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room, Eleanor began clearing the table. As she took their barely touched plates to the sink, she paused at the doorway when she heard Kristen whisper, "She really thinks she's a good cook, doesn't she? Bless her heart." Marshall snorted. "I told you, she's stuck in 1985. Nobody eats like this anymore." Leela giggled, adding, "It's like being on one of those food challenge shows, but sad." Eleanor's grip tightened on the dish she was holding. For a moment, she considered walking in and confronting them, demanding respect. But instead, she turned back to the kitchen in silence, her face expressionless. She scrubbed each dish with precision, as if scrubbing away the sting of humiliation. The sound of the running water helped drown out their laughter. Later that night, after they had left with barely a goodbye, Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table. A single overhead bulb flickered above her, casting long shadows. She stared at her wrinkled hands that had fed them for decades, bandaged skinned knees, held trembling spoons during sick nights, and stirred countless pots of comfort food. She retrieved her journal from the cabinet drawer, one she hadn't touched in years. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but it still felt like an old friend. She opened it and began to write, her pen moving slowly at first, then with more purpose. "They laughed at my food today," she wrote. "My son, my own blood, Kristen, and that child. They mocked the very thing that made our house a home. I feel invisible. Like all those years of stirring and seasoning, baking and boiling, meant nothing." Her pen paused. "But I'm not done. Not yet. If the world won't come to my table, then maybe I need to take my table to the world." That sentence lingered on the page, a spark of something deeper, anger perhaps, but also resolve. Eleanor had never considered herself ambitious. She was a mother, a wife, and now a widow. Her dreams had always been for others, making sure Marshall got through college, supporting Thomas through his illness, volunteering at church potlucks. She had forgotten what it meant to dream for herself. That night, she couldn't sleep. She wandered to the attic, rummaging through boxes of her past. Photos, baby clothes, old greeting cards. And then she saw it, a worn-out wooden recipe box with a faded blue ribbon tied around it. Her mother's recipe box. She carried it downstairs and sat at the table again. The smell of aged paper and vanilla beans greeted her as she opened the lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten recipe cards, some dotted with oil stains, others curling at the edges. She picked up one labeled Mama's Buttermilk Biscuits and traced her fingers over the ink. Each card brought back a memory: Sunday brunches, Christmas dinners, picnics with neighbors. Her mother had always said, "Food is more than taste, it's memory, it's emotion. It's how we tell our stories." Eleanor closed her eyes and wept softly, not out of defeat, but from remembering that her food did tell a story, a rich, soulful, unapologetic story of who she was and where she came from. And that story wasn't something to be mocked, it was something to be honored. By morning, her sorrow had transmuted into something stronger. She tied her hair back into a bun, put on her floral apron, and began cooking again, not for her son, not for approval, but for herself. She measured, whisked, and seasoned with care. Then she did something she'd never done before. She took a photo of her peach cobbler, plated neatly under natural light, and uploaded it to YouTube with the title, Southern Comfort by Granny Flame, the perfect peach cobbler. She didn't expect anyone to see it, but as the first view trickled in, then 5, then 50, something flickered in her chest. She didn't know what lay ahead. She only knew one thing. She would no longer let their laughter define her. She would feed the world her story, one dish at a time. The morning after Eleanor uploaded her first video felt no different than any other. The house was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds outside and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She stood at her window, sipping coffee from a chipped floral mug, looking out onto the overgrown garden that Thomas once took great pride in. The peach tree by the fence was starting to bloom soft pinks, peeking out like nature's small applause. She found herself smiling faintly, not because she expected anything extraordinary to happen, but because for the first time in a long while, she felt like she'd done something just for herself. The recipe box sat on the table beside her, its lid open, inviting her to dive into it once more. She ran her fingers along the yellowing cards, pulling out one labeled Southern Fried Green Tomatoes with Spicy Remoulade. Her mother's handwriting was slanted and deliberate, each line a memory etched in time. Eleanor remembered those summer days when Mama would slice tomatoes fresh from the garden and let her sprinkle the cornmeal batter like fairy dust. There was a magic to it, a rhythm, a dance between generations. After a small breakfast, she prepared the ingredients to film another video. This time, she set her old phone on a stack of cookbooks and used a lamp from her sewing room to light the kitchen counter. She had no professional tools, no high-end camera or ring light, but what she lacked in equipment she made up for in soul. With practiced hands, she coated the tomato slices in seasoned cornmeal and buttermilk, her soft southern accent narrating each step with gentleness and grace. Now don't rush the frying, she said, the oil crackling behind her like applause. Let M dance in the pan a minute. That's how they get golden, like the sun-kissed M. She uploaded the video to her newly named channel, Granny Flame's Kitchen, and closed her laptop, not giving it another thought. Her intention wasn't fame or followers, it was healing. Cooking had always been her language of love, and if no one in her own family wanted to hear it, maybe someone else out there would. By the end of the week, Eleanor checked her video again, more out of curiosity than expectation. Her eyes widened. The peach cobbler video had over 5,000 views. Comments poured in. Reminds me of my grandma's Sunday desserts. Thank you for this. Granny Flame, you're the real deal. Where have you been all my life? We need more videos. Tears welled up in her eyes. Not from sadness, but something closer to joy, a quiet kind of validation that had been absent for so long. She responded to every comment, signing each with, from Granny Flame. That evening, she lit a candle by the photo of Thomas in the living room and whispered, "Can you believe it, honey? People like my food again." Asterisk. The next few weeks passed in a kind of creative frenzy. Eleanor recorded videos every other day, exploring more of her family's recipes: chicken and dumplings, red velvet cake, skillet cornbread, banana pudding. Each video was laced with a story, a memory, or a tip only a seasoned cook would know. Her charm wasn't in the polish, it was in the authenticity. Viewers weren't just watching for recipes, they were watching for her. Asterisk. Behind the scenes, she began experimenting more, adjusting ingredients, adding new flavors she had never dared to mix before. She tried replacing lard with duck fat in her biscuits and swapped traditional sweet tea for an infused, herbal version. Slowly, Eleanor began to find her own voice as a cook, not just repeating the past, but reinventing it. Asterisk. One day, she received an email from a woman named Jasmine Langford. Eleanor squinted at the name, unsure whether it was real or spam. Jasmine introduced herself as a New York-based food critic and YouTube culinary curator. She wrote that Eleanor's videos had captivated her and that she was curating a series called Flavors Across America, which featured underrepresented voices in food. Jasmine asked if Eleanor would consider a video call to discuss the possibility of participating. Asterisk. Eleanor reread the email 3 times, her heart thumping. She clutched the arms of her chair, debating whether to reply. She didn't consider herself media material. What did she know of food critics or features? Her son would probably call it another old lady fantasy. But the Eleanor of yesterday no longer had authority over today. With trembling fingers, she typed a response. Asterisk. Dear Miss Langford, I'd be honored to speak with you. Best, Eleanor Heart Granny Flame. Asterisk. They arranged a call 2 days later. Eleanor wore her best blue blouse and pinned her silver curls back with a barrette that had belonged to her mother. She sat before the camera, nervous, her palms sweating slightly. Asterisk. Jasmine appeared on screen young, stylish, and warm. She complimented Eleanor's storytelling and her ability to create emotion through food. People are craving honesty these days, Jasmine said. Your videos are like a breath of fresh southern air in a world full of synthetic trends. Asterisk. Eleanor blushed. Well, I just cook from the heart, that's all I know. Asterisk. Jasmine invited her to be a featured chef at an upcoming pop-up dinner in New York City. The theme was legacy on a plate, and they wanted Eleanor to present 3 courses from her heritage. She would be paired with a sous chef to assist her, and all travel would be covered. Asterisk. The idea of flying to New York, of cooking for strangers, terrified her, but Jasmine's confidence was contagious. Before the call ended, Eleanor nodded. I'll do it. I'll bring Georgia to your table. Asterisk. After the call, she sat in stunned silence. She couldn't wait to tell someone, but there was no one left she could call with joy. Her friends from church would say she was crazy, and Marshall would probably laugh in disbelief. Asterisk. Instead, she opened her journal. Asterisk. They want me in New York, she wrote. Someone wants my food, my story, me. I feel alive again, like Mama's whispering recipes in my ear. I'm terrified, but I'm going to cook like I've never cooked before. Asterisk. Preparing for the pop-up became her full-time mission. She practiced day and night, often falling asleep with flowers still dusting her fingertips. She chose her menu with care. A starter of deviled eggs with pickled okra and smoked paprika. A main dish of buttermilk fried quail over creamed grits and collard greens. And desserts, her now famous peach cobbler served with a bourbon glaze. Asterisk. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the kind of nervous excitement usually reserved for young people at the start of their dreams. She ordered a new pair of shoes, packed her aprons, and stood before her mirror, rehearsing how she would introduce each dish. Asterisk. As her flight neared, she posted one last video before her trip, calling it The Journey Begins. She stood in her kitchen, apron tied, voice trembling with emotion. Asterisk. I started this channel to share memories. I didn't expect it to change my life. But here I am, an old lady from Georgia, heading to New York City to cook for the world. If you've ever felt invisible, too old, or too late to start something new, just remember, the kitchen doesn't care about age, it only asks for your heart. Asterisk. The video exploded. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of starting over, of being underestimated, of chasing dreams late in life. Eleanor became a symbol, an unexpected hero for anyone who thought their time had passed. Asterisk. On the morning of her flight, she stood in her doorway with her suitcase, took one last look at the quiet kitchen that had carried her through grief, shame, and rebirth, and whispered, "Thank you." She locked the door, took a deep breath, and walked toward her future. She didn't know what New York would bring, but she knew she wouldn't return the same woman who had once been mocked at her own dinner table. When Eleanor stepped out of the airport into the bustling pulse of New York City, it felt like she had entered another world. The air was heavy with the scent of food carts, car exhaust, and ambition. Taxis zipped by with indifference, neon billboards blinked above her, and strangers brushed past, caught in the chaos of their own lives. For a moment, she stood frozen, clutching her old leather suitcase, her fingers wrapped tight around its worn handle, as if it were the only familiar thing in this strange, kinetic world. Her contact from the pop-up event. A tall and efficient young man named Marco found her near the taxi stand. He greeted her with warmth, but moved quickly, checking his watch and waving toward the waiting car. "We're behind schedule," he said, as he ushered her inside. "Everyone's been dying to meet you, Granny Flame." Eleanor gave a shy smile, still trying to believe this was really happening. The city outside blurred as they drove through narrow streets and wide avenues, weaving between people, food trucks, and sidewalk artists. Eleanor's heart pounded, half from excitement and half from doubt. What was she doing here, really? She wasn't a professional chef. She had never trained in a culinary school or used half the tools she'd seen in YouTube tutorials. She was just a southern widow who cooked with memory and muscle memory. They arrived at the Venue, a converted warehouse in Brooklyn that had been transformed into a temporary fine dining space. White drapes floated from the ceilings, soft jazz played through overhead speakers, and rows of long wooden tables were already being prepped with polished silverware and candles. In the open kitchen at the far end, half a dozen chefs moved in a perfectly choreographed chaos. Jasmine Langford stood near the entrance, her dark curls pinned back, dressed in a tailored black suit. She beamed when she saw Eleanor and walked toward her with open arms. "You made it," she said, hugging her like an old friend. "I sure did," Eleanor replied, still unsure whether to feel at home or out of place. Jasmine introduced her to the culinary team, which included sous chefs, line cooks, and the kitchen manager, whose eyes scanned Eleanor with slight curiosity. Among them was a lean, serious-looking woman named Yuki, assigned as Eleanor's sous chef for the evening. Yuki's handshake was firm, her voice measured. "I watched your videos," she said. "You've got heart. Let's see what you've got in person." Eleanor smiled, trying not to let the nerves show. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Ingredients were delivered, stations were set, and the dishes Eleanor had practiced for weeks began to take shape under her direction. The deviled eggs with pickled okra were first, each halved egg piped with a creamy filling and topped with slivers of bright green okra, finished with a pinch of smoked paprika. Yuki's precision complemented Eleanor's instinct. Where Eleanor tasted and adjusted on the spot, Yuki measured and analyzed. It was a rhythm that, after some initial stumbles, found a harmony. As they prepped the quail, Eleanor noticed a few of the younger chefs watching her skeptically. One of them, a sharp-tongued line cook named Matteo, whispered to a colleague loud enough for her to hear, "This is what we're doing now. Grandma cooking comfort food at a fine dining event." Eleanor didn't respond. Instead, she focused on the skillet, watching the quail sear to a perfect crisp, the skin browning just right, the meat retaining its moisture. She ladled spoonfuls of creamy grits onto the plates, topped with the quail, and placed sautéed collard greens on the side, finishing each dish with a drizzle of the sauce she'd reduced from hours of slow cooking. When Jasmine came for the tasting, she closed her eyes after the first bite. "It's like being hugged," she said. "Your food. It tells a story. Don't change a thing." The evening arrived swiftly. The warehouse, now softly lit, filled with food critics, influencers, restaurateurs, and lovers of food. Jasmine took the stage briefly, introducing the night's theme legacy on a plate, and spoke about the importance of honoring culinary heritage through voices that hadn't always been given a platform. When she introduced Eleanor, the applause was polite but cautious. Eleanor, wearing a clean apron and her mother's vintage brooch, stepped forward. Her voice was calm, her words unrehearsed but sincere. Asterisk, I come from a little town in Georgia where my mama taught me to cook, not just with salt and spices, but with stories. Every recipe in my book has a person behind it, a smile, a Sunday, a storm. Tonight, I'm not here to impress you. I'm just here to remind you that food, when made with love, never gets old. Asterisk, the guests began eating, one table at a time. Their expressions changed. First curiosity, then surprise, and finally satisfaction. They weren't just tasting the food, they were experiencing it. Conversations paused, eyes closed. Some smiled. Some looked at their companions and nodded silently. One critic put down his fork, leaned back, and simply whispered, "Damn." Asterisk, as dessert rolled out, Eleanor's iconic peach cobbler with bourbon glaze and a scoop of handmade vanilla ice cream, the room buzzed. Phones came out, photos were taken. Guests asked to meet her, to shake her hand, to hear her story. Asterisk later, Jasmine brought Eleanor aside, her eyes wide with excitement. "You did it," she whispered. "You've got something real. Not everyone gets that kind of reaction in a room like this. One of the Michelin scouts was here tonight." Asterisk, Eleanor blinked. "What does that mean?" Asterisk, "It means," Jasmine said, "they noticed you." Asterisk, but perhaps the most surprising moment came near the end of the night when Mateo, the skeptical line cook, approached her with 2 empty dessert plates in hand. Asterisk, "I was wrong," he admitted, his pride clearly struggling. "That cobbler, it's like poetry in a bowl." Asterisk, Eleanor chuckled, wiping her hands on a towel. "I've been told a lot worse than that," she said, "but thank you." Asterisk, back in her hotel that night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, barefoot, holding her journal. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, Asterisk, "They didn't just eat the food, they felt it. I saw it on their faces, the way their shoulders softened, the way their eyes closed. That's what Mama used to say, if it don't reach the heart, it don't belong on the plate. I belong here. Maybe not forever, but for tonight, I belonged." Asterisk, she looked at her reflection in the window, silver-haired, tired, smiling. There were still doubts, of course. What if it had all been a fluke? What if they forgot her by morning? Asterisk, but somewhere deep in her gut, the same place where recipes simmered and intuition stirred, Eleanor knew better. Something had changed. Not just around her, but within her. Asterisk, she received a text from Jasmine. "Critics are raving already. We're getting interview requests for you. You might want to consider staying longer." Asterisk, Eleanor stared at the message for a long time. She thought of her quiet kitchen back home, of the family who laughed at her table, of the cobbler that once sat untouched. And then she whispered into the dark, "Let's see what happens next." Eleanor woke to the soft light of a gray New York dawn filtering through the hotel window. The adrenaline from the night before still hummed faintly in her veins. She sat upright in the unfamiliar bed, stretching her arms as the ache of long hours in the kitchen settled into her bones like an old friend. The memory of applause, the sparkle in Jasmine's eyes, and the taste of her peach cobbler lingering on a stranger's smile all returned to her slowly, like morning sunlight creeping across a room. Asterisk, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Dozens of messages lit up the screen. Jasmine had sent her a stream of articles and social media posts, photos of her dishes, reviews from food bloggers, and one startling headline, "Granny Flame sets the culinary scene ablaze at Brooklyn Pop." Her name was trending. One critic had written, "Eleanor Hart is proof that food doesn't need to be reinvented, only remembered." Asterisk, Eleanor placed her hand gently over her chest. It wasn't pride that swelled and hurt, it was astonishment. She had spent her life being told that she was ordinary, that her ways were outdated, her talents quaint and disposable, in a world spinning too fast to notice a slow-cooked stew. But here, in this new world of culinary elites and spotlight reviews, she had arrived like a storm no one expected but everyone remembered. Asterisk, she spent the morning answering messages, thanking people for their kindness, reading messages from strangers who shared memories her food reminded them of. "My Nana used to make cobbler like that," one woman wrote. "Watching you brought her back." Another said, "You're not just cooking, you're healing." Asterisk, Eleanor moved quietly through the day, meeting Jasmine later that afternoon at a small cafe. They sat outside, sipping coffee as city life buzzed around them. Asterisk, "You changed the energy in that room," Jasmine said, looking over her sunglasses. "No one expected it. Not from you." Asterisk, Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "From me." Asterisk, Jasmine didn't flinch. "Not from someone over 60. from Georgia, with no formal training. The culinary world doesn't make space easily for people like you, but you didn't ask for permission. You just cooked, and they had to pay attention. Asterisk Eleanor nodded slowly, letting the words settle. I didn't come here for attention, she said softly. I just needed to remember that I mattered, that what I love still has a place. Asterisk Jasmine leaned forward. It has more than a place. It has power. Asterisk that evening, Eleanor was invited to visit one of the city's high-profile kitchens, an ultra-modern restaurant in Manhattan that had recently earned its second Michelin-Star. Jasmine arranged the meeting. The executive chef, a stern man named Francois with a reputation for perfectionism, greeted Eleanor with the kind of cautious curiosity usually reserved for unproven ingredients. Asterisk, we heard about your performance last night, he said. I wanted to see the woman behind the cobbler. Asterisk, his kitchen was everything. Eleanor's was not sleek metallic, filled with equipment she didn't recognize and tools she had never used. She watched as his team operated with mechanical precision, measuring ingredients by grams, using tweezers to place garnishes, flames hissing and timers beeping in a language she didn't speak. Asterisk Francois handed her an apron. Show me something, he said. Asterisk Eleanor hesitated, looking around. You got a cast iron pan. Asterisk he raised an eyebrow but obliged. She walked to the station, pulling ingredients from her bag. Cornmeal, buttermilk, salt, a handful of fresh okra, fried okra, she said. No fancy foam, no hidden tricks, just something that'll make you want to call your mama. Asterisk as the oil heated, chefs gathered around. Eleanor worked methodically, slicing, battering, and frying. She didn't explain every step. She didn't apologize. The room smelled of the South comfort and memory in equal measure. Asterisk when she plated it, she simply handed it to Francois. He tasted, paused, and then nodded once. It's perfect, he said, unexpected, balanced, nostalgic, but refined. It was the closest thing to praise he ever offered. Jasmine later told her that Francois had asked for her contact. He sees what I see, she said. You're not a trend. You're timeless. Asterisk back at the hotel, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Her mind drifted to Marshall, Kristen, and Lila. She hadn't spoken to them since she left Georgia. She wondered if they'd seen the articles, if Marshall had read the headlines and felt even a twinge of regret, but no message had come. No call. Just silence. She pulled out her journal again. They treat me like a stranger now, she wrote. Like my story ended the moment they stopped listening. But I've found a new chapter, one they won't understand until they see the cover on someone else's shelf. Asterisk the next morning, she received an offer. Jasmine, alongside an investor, wanted to open a boutique restaurant featuring Eleanor's take on Southern fusion cuisine. We'll call it Eleanor's Table, Jasmine said, her voice alight with excitement. You'll have full creative control. We'll do seasonal menus, spotlight legacy recipes, think Michelin-level soul food. Asterisk Eleanor blinked, speechless. You want me to run a restaurant? Asterisk we'll hire a team. You'll guide them, train them, teach them what makes your food yours. Asterisk the thought thrilled and terrified her. She hadn't run anything beyond a PTA bake sale, but a restaurant in New York. I don't belong here, she whispered. You do, Jasmine said. You already proved that. The only question is, do you want to stay? Asterisk Eleanor asked for time. She spent that afternoon walking through Central Park, feeding ducks with pieces of leftover cornbread she had packed for herself. She watched children play, lovers argue quietly on benches, and artists sketch strangers for $20 a portrait. She felt oddly peaceful, as though she had peeled away a part of her old life and found a new skin underneath, not different, just rediscovered. Asterisk later that night, in her hotel room, she filmed another video for her followers. The peach tree painting from her kitchen was now her channel background. She wore her red apron and began with a gentle smile. Asterisk, y'all been with me through more than just recipes. You've been with me through remembering who I am. Tonight, I want to share something different. Asterisk, she told them about the pop-up, the kitchen with Francois, and the restaurant offer. Her voice trembled with vulnerability. Asterisk, I spent a long time thinking I was just a mom, just a widow, just a cook who got laughed at by her own family. But this city, it saw me, not for who I was, but for what I could still be. The comments poured in within minutes. Do IT Granny Flame, your story is everything. Start that restaurant wheel. be your first customers. Asterisk asked. She watched the messages roll in. Eleanor thought of her mother, of Thomas, of the long line of women who had stirred pots with love and never asked for praise. Maybe this wasn't just about her. Maybe it was about all of them. She picked up her phone and called Jasmine. "I'm in," she said. Asterisk, and just like that, Eleanor Hart, once mocked at her own kitchen table, had agreed to open a restaurant in the heart of New York City. Asterisk, opening a restaurant in New York City was not a dream Eleanor had ever dared to dream. Yet now she stood in the middle of a half-finished space in Soho, staring at exposed brick walls and dangling wires, while contractors, designers, and chefs bustled around her like bees building a hive. The noise was constant hammers, drills, raised voices, but Eleanor was calm, standing at the center of it all in her floral print apron, holding a notebook filled with scribbled ideas and old recipes. Her fingers brushed the cover like it was sacred scripture. Asterisk Jasmine was everywhere, coordinating contractors, reviewing menu mock-ups, handling PR. The investor, a savvy woman named Priya Mehta, had been charmed by Eleanor's story and insisted the restaurant have her full name in gold script over the door. Eleanor's table. "This place is about honoring you," Priya had said, "and through you, honoring generations of women whose food never made it onto white tablecloths." Asterisk, the concept was ambitious. Upscale Southern cuisine with modern influences, rooted in family recipes and emotional storytelling. Eleanor was given full control over the menu, but that came with a responsibility she had never carried before: building a kitchen team, training them, managing prep schedules, food sourcing, and vendor negotiations. It was a steep climb for someone who had cooked alone in a quiet home kitchen for decades. Asterisk, her first week of kitchen training was humbling. The team she had to lead included sous chefs trained in Paris, line cooks who had worked under celebrity chefs, and a pastry chef named Arlo, who looked like he'd just walked off a runway. Many of them respected her story but questioned her authority. She could feel it in their eyes, in the way they asked if she was sure about measurements or offered to adjust her seasoning. Asterisk Eleanor kept her chin high and said little. Instead, she proved herself by doing what she knew best, cooking. Every morning, she arrived before anyone else and prepped her station. She showed them how to make buttermilk biscuits from scratch, not with a stand mixer but by hand, feeling the dough's tenderness. She taught them how to braise oxtail in a slow, methodical way that let the meat fall apart like silk and turn the broth into velvet. When a prep cook over-seasoned the collard greens with vinegar, she didn't scold him. She simply added a dash of brown sugar, a squeeze of orange, and turned the dish into something new. Asterisk, word began to spread in the kitchen. She wasn't just a sentimental story. She was a force. Asterisk, but the challenges came quickly and from all directions. The restaurant's soft launch date was set for 6 weeks ahead, and the menu still hadn't been finalized. Jasmine insisted they include a few elevated dishes to satisfy the fine dining, crowd foams, reductions, artistic plating. Eleanor resisted at first. "My food isn't meant to be painted on a plate," she said. "It's meant to be eaten, remembered." Asterisk, they compromised. She would design the heart of the menu: starters like deviled eggs with pickled shallots and fried catfish sliders on brioche, mains like duck gumbo and herb-crusted pork with peach chutney, and her desserts, always personal, like her bourbon pecan pie with sea salt caramel. Jasmine and Arlo would help refine the presentation, turning Eleanor's rustic flavors into elegant, plated memories. Asterisk. Then came the pressure from media outlets. New York Magazine wanted an exclusive. Food and Wine requested a feature. Eleanor was asked to appear on morning shows, podcasts, even shoot a short documentary on culinary elders. It felt overwhelming. She had never liked the spotlight. Cooking had always been her quiet joy, her rebellion against grief and loneliness. Now it was on display, and she worried whether she was worthy of the attention. Asterisk, one night, exhausted after 14 hours on her feet, she collapsed into the worn couch in her small apartment above the restaurant. She stared at her swollen ankles, the raw patches on her palms, and wondered if she had made a mistake. The fame, the pressure, the daily battle to prove she belonged in a world of young, fast-talking chefs. It was more than she had anticipated. Asterisk. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the old messages from her YouTube followers. One in particular stopped her. "Your hands remind me of my grandmother's. They're the hands that fed us, held us, never let go. Don't let go, Granny Flame. The world needs you." Asterisk, tears filled her eyes. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for every woman who had been told she was too old, too simple, too late. The next morning, she returned to the kitchen with a renewed sense of purpose. She began teaching her staff not just techniques, but context. She told them about her mother's kitchen, where everything was measured in pinches and handfuls. She explained why fried green tomatoes needed just the right amount of cornmeal texture, and why her red beans and rice always included bay leaves grown in her backyard. Slowly, the staff began to see her not as a novelty, but as a wellspring of culinary wisdom. Arlo, the pastry chef, started sitting beside her during breaks, asking questions about her cobbler ratios. Yuki, once distant, became her biggest supporter, often translating Eleanor's instinctive methods into modern kitchen terms for the rest of the team. Matteo, the once skeptical line cook from the pop-up, asked her to teach him how to make sweet tea the way only grandmamas do. As the soft opening approached, Eleanor organized a memory dinner for the Staffa trial run, where each dish was served with a story. She stood in the kitchen before each course and shared what the dish meant to her. These hush puppies, she said, were the first thing I ever learned to fry. Mama used to say they were for the in-between moments, not a meal, not a snack, just a little something to hold you. With each course, something in the kitchen changed. The staff stopped seeing food as performance and began seeing it as emotion. The dishes weren't just items on a menu, they were living legacies. Eleanor watched it happen and felt something in her own heart soften. Maybe she hadn't just come here to cook. Maybe she had come to teach. On the night of the soft opening, the room was filled with invited guest critics, influencers, food writers, and curious locals. Jasmine wore a black evening dress, and Eleanor donned a deep blue chef's coat, embroidered with gold letters, Chef Eleanor Hart. When she walked into the dining room, the room stood and applauded. Each dish was served with a note, a short paragraph about its origin. Guests were moved. Some cried. One woman clutched Eleanor's hand and said, "I never knew food could make me feel this way." When the final plate was cleared, a quiet settled in the room. Eleanor stood at the front, surrounded by her team. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes wet with emotion. "I was once told my food was a joke," she said. "I believed that for too long. But tonight, I cooked like my mama did, like her mama did, and I did it with the same hands they gave me." The applause was thunderous that night. As she closed the kitchen and turned out the lights, Eleanor stood alone in the quiet space. She touched the wooden countertops, still warm from the day's service, and felt the pulse of something bigger than herself. She didn't need Michelin stars. She didn't need magazine covers. What she had created was a table where stories lived, where memories were fed and feelings were honored. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. The days following Eleanor's soft opening passed in a blur of exhilaration, exhaustion, and unexpected triumphs. Word of mouth spread faster than any press release. Food bloggers called Eleanor's table a sanctuary of soul. Critics described her dishes as elegantly nostalgic and a masterclass in culinary storytelling. Within a week, the restaurant had a 2-month waiting list. The staff moved with a new rhythm, respectful, energized, and united by Eleanor's steady guidance. Even the most skeptical chefs now called her Chef Hart without irony or hesitation. Yet, amidst the praise and momentum, Eleanor felt the quiet undertow of pressure. Every seat in that restaurant carried a story, an expectation, a craving not just for food but for connection. She could see it in the eyes of the diners who sat in reverent silence after the first bite. Her recipes had become more than meals. They were messages, wrapped in layers of memory and grief and pride. And with each passing day, that responsibility began to weigh heavier. The media attention had only grown louder. Television crews came to film segments in the kitchen. Lifestyle magazines requested interviews. The New York Times ran a Sunday spread titled Granny Flame, the woman who turned Southern soul into haute cuisine. With it came another wave of reservations, press inquiries, and invitations for guest chef appearances. Jasmine, ever the visionary, suggested they consider expanding, perhaps a second location in Atlanta or Chicago. Eleanor listened, smiled politely, and said she'd think about it. But she hadn't come here for empire building. She had come to be heard. One chilly morning, Eleanor sat alone in her office, a modest room tucked behind the kitchen pantry. A stack of letters from fans rested beside her teacup. Some were typed, others handwritten on lined notebook paper. One letter stood outwritten in shaky cursive on floral stationery. It was from a woman in rural Mississippi, a widow named Loretta, who had watched every video Eleanor had ever posted. Asterisk, you made me remember who I used to be. The letter read, before the world got loud and I got small. Thank you for showing me I'm not too late. Asterisk, Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest. It reminded her why she began all of this. It wasn't to impress critics or fill seats. It was to reclaim something lost: dignity, worth, voice. Asterisk, but not everyone was celebrating her success. Asterisk, one evening, as Eleanor rested after service, her phone buzzed with a name she hadn't seen in months. Her breath caught. For a moment, she stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. 1,000 possibilities rushed through her mind. Was he calling to apologize? To ask for a visit? To tell her he'd seen her name in the paper? Asterisk, she answered. Hello, asterisk, Mom. His voice was clipped, hesitant. I saw the article, the restaurant stuff. Asterisk, she waited. Yes. Asterisk, there was a pause. I didn't realize you were really doing this. Eleanor said nothing. I mean, it's just kind of a surprise. Kristen said it's all over her feed. Even Leela mentioned it. You're like, famous now. Asterisk, Eleanor chuckled softly, though it didn't reach her eyes. No, sweetheart, I'm just being seen. Asterisk, he cleared his throat. Well, listen, I was wondering, Kristen's cousin is in the restaurant business. She wants to open something in Charlotte. Maybe you could talk to her, give her a little advice, maybe even partner. Asterisk, the audacity stung like a slap. Not a single word of congratulations. No acknowledgement of the cruelty she'd endured. Just a favor wrapped in casual entitlement. Asterisk, Eleanor's voice was cool. I'm not in the business of building someone else's table anymore, Marshall. I've finally set my own. Asterisk, he was silent. Right, well, I just thought I'd ask. Asterisk, I'm glad you did, she said, her tone gentle but firm. Now you know how it feels to want a seat. Asterisk, she hung up and stared at her phone. For a long moment, she didn't move. The past had knocked on her door, expecting an invitation. She had closed it with grace. That night, Eleanor didn't write in her journal. She didn't need to. The silence spoke clearly. Asterisk, meanwhile, in the kitchen, something miraculous was happening. Asterisk, her dish braised duck with spiced fig glaze and sweet potato grits had been selected by the Michelin Guide inspectors for re-evaluation. Rumors spread that Eleanor's table was under serious consideration for a star. Jasmine broke the news over coffee, practically vibrating with excitement. Asterisk, this is it, she said. You're going to be the first woman over 60 without formal training to win a Michelin-Star. Can you imagine? Asterisk, Eleanor stirred her tea slowly. I never cooked for stars. I cooked for stories. Asterisk, Jasmine smiled. And that's exactly why you're winning. Asterisk, still, the prospect changed the energy in the kitchen. Suddenly, every detail became sacred. Plates were double-checked. Timers were triple-set. Staff worked in hyper-focus. Eleanor, however, remained steady. She reminded them gently, but firmly. We serve souls, not stars. Asterisk, the night the inspector arrived. They didn't know who he or she was. That was the rule: anonymous, unseen, present only in the flick of a fork or the glint of a wineglass. The dining room was full of laughter and quiet reverence. Eleanor cooked with her usual grace, her hands moving from station to station, checking salt levels, searing meat, adjusting heat. Asterisk, after service, the staff exhaled collectively. They'd done their best. The rest was out of their hands. Asterisk, 2 weeks passed. No word. Then one morning, just as the city shook off a stormy night, Jasmine burst into the kitchen, holding her phone aloft. Asterisk, it's official, she said, voice trembling. 1 star. Eleanor's table just earned a Michelin-Star. Asterisk, cheers erupted. Staff hugged. Yuki cried openly. Arlo baked a celebratory cake that read, Granny did it, in sugared script. Photographers arrived within the hour. The restaurant was flooded with calls. Asterisk, but Eleanor stood quietly by the window of her office, holding the star certificate. Her fingers traced the embossed lettering. For a moment, she thought of Thomas, of her mother, of the empty chairs in her home kitchen, of all the times she was laughed at, dismissed, reduced to a caricature of tradition. Asterisk, Then she walked into the dining room and placed the star plaque on a small side table beneath a photo of her mother, holding a bowl of biscuit dough, flour on her apron, love in her eyes. Asterisk, this star, she said to the room, belongs to her too. Asterisk, that night, Eleanor took the long way home. She walked the city streets, coat buttoned up, hands gloved, eyes wide with wonder. Lights shimmered on the wet pavement. The air was sharp with winter. She passed a bus stop where an elderly woman sat reading a newspaper with Eleanor's photo on the front page. She watched the woman smile. Asterisk, back in her apartment, Eleanor made herself tea, sat on her small balcony, and finally opened her journal. Asterisk, they mocked my cooking. They said I was too old, too stuck, too soft. But the world was hungry for softness. It needed a reminder that food can be more than art, it can be memory. I didn't chase this. I answered it. And tonight, the whole world tasted what I've always known. I am not forgotten. I am not past. I am just now being served. Eleanor Hart stood at the edge of her success, wrapped in the golden glow of a Michelin-Star. But the ache in her chest reminded her that some victories came with shadows. As the weeks rolled on, Eleanor's table became more than became a phenomenon. Reservations stretched for months in advance. Celebrities stopped by unannounced. Food critics who once brushed her off now wrote about the transformative warmth of her cuisine. Yet, even in the noise of celebration, Eleanor began to feel a quiet pull toward home, not the restaurant, but her real home in Georgia, where her story had begun and where, despite everything, a part of her heart remained anchored. That asterisk, she hadn't seen Marshall or Kristen since that curt phone call. No word had come from Lila either, though Eleanor sometimes watched her granddaughter's dance videos online, a bittersweet routine of silent observation. In New York, Eleanor was admired, respected, applauded, but in Georgia, she had once been loved, or so she believed. Asterisk, on a Tuesday morning, in the middle of menu planning for a spring relaunch, Eleanor received a letter. It was handwritten in messy, uneven strokes. She recognized Lila's handwriting immediately. The envelope was pale pink, with a small flower sticker sealing it. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Asterisk, dear Grandma, it began. I saw your restaurant on TikTok. I didn't know you were famous. I'm sorry I made fun of your cooking. I think I was just copying Mom and Dad. I watched your peach cobbler video. I missed that taste. I miss you. Asterisk, there were a few drawings, hearts, a tiny cobbler dish, and one of Eleanor wearing a chef's hat. Beneath it was one final line. Can I come visit you one day? Asterisk, Eleanor wept quietly, not from grief, but from the thawing of a wound she hadn't realized was still bleeding. The next day, she wrote back. She sent a photo of the restaurant and a recipe card in her neat cursive titled Lila's Peach Cobbler. She wrote, yes, my sweet girl, my table is always open for you. Asterisk, that letter shifted something in her. She began thinking not about expansion or fame, but legacy. What was she building, really? A restaurant? Or a place where stories live on? Asterisk, the decision came quietly. One night, as she walked through the dining room after closing, she paused at a table by the window. It was her favorite seat, the one where sunlight hit just right in the afternoons, where she'd often seen elderly couples hold hands while sharing spoonfuls of dessert. She sat down and looked around at the empty chairs, the soft flicker of candlelight bouncing off the glassware. It was beautiful, but it wasn't the end of her journey. It was the middle. Asterisk, the next morning, she called Jasmine and Priya in for a meeting. Asterisk, I want to go home, she said simply. They looked stunned. You're leaving? Priya asked. Asterisk, I'm not quitting, Eleanor said, but I want to return to Georgia for a while, teach cooking classes, host Sunday dinners, open the doors to women like me who've never seen a restaurant kitchen but have been feeding families their whole lives. Asterisk, Jasmine leaned back, studying her. You want to replicate the heart of this place in your hometown. Asterisk, I want to plant seeds, Eleanor said. Let others grow them. Asterisk, there was silence for a moment. Then Jasmine smiled. Then let's build a program. Eleanor's table doesn't have to be just one place. It can be a movement. Asterisk, in the following weeks, Eleanor began laying the groundwork for a mentorship initiative called the Legacy Kituna, nonprofit dedicated to empowering older women with cooking talent to find their voice, tell their stories, and even open their own businesses. They would be trained in Eleanor's methods, but more importantly, encouraged to preserve their own traditions. Asterisk, before she left, she hosted a farewell dinner one final night, to celebrate the journey thus far. The guest list was small and meaningful. Her staff, a few early fans, Jasmine and Priya, and one seat left conspicuously empty. Eleanor stood before them. No microphone needed, her voice clear and firm. Some meals feed your stomach, some feed your soul. This place has fed both, but now it's time to take what we've made and share it with the world that still feels invisible. I'm going home. Not to retreat, but to extend the table. After the dinner, she walked through the kitchen one last time, touching the countertop, the spice rack, the oven knobs, each one a part of her story. She whispered goodbye, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Returning to Georgia felt like stepping back into an old, familiar song. The house was the same, the faded shutters, the creaky porch swing, the magnolia tree leaning slightly in the yard, but Eleanor was different. She unpacked boxes filled with spices from around the world, cookbooks, framed photographs from Eleanor's table, and a Michelin plaque that she placed not in her living room, but in the kitchen above the stove. Word spread quickly in town. Some old friends visited shyly, unsure how to greet the now famous Eleanor Hart, but she put them at ease the way she always had, with a cup of tea and something warm baking in the oven. She converted the barn out back into a teaching kitchen with rows of counters and stoves, open windows, and long communal tables. Every Saturday, women from across the county arrived, some in aprons, some in wheelchairs, all carrying memories tucked in recipe cards. They cooked together, laughed, cried, and learned. One afternoon, as she was teaching how to make hush puppies, a familiar voice called from the doorway. Eleanor turned, and there stood Marshall. He looked older than she remembered, his hair thinner, his face lined with worry. I saw your program, he said softly, and Leela begged me to come. She's outside. Eleanor walked to the door. Leela stood beside the car, holding a basket. When she saw her grandmother, she ran forward and wrapped her arms around her waist. I brought peaches, she said, smiling. Eleanor knelt down and kissed her forehead. Then, let's make something unforgettable. That evening, the three of them sat at the kitchen table, just like they used to. They peeled peaches, mixed dough, and laughed. Marshall watched his mother carefully, his expression tinged with regret and awe. I was wrong, he finally said, about everything. Eleanor looked at him, eyes kind but firm. You didn't believe in me, but I believed in myself. That's what saved me. He nodded, and for the first time in years, their silence held peace. Later that night, after Leela had fallen asleep upstairs and Marshall had gone home, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, watching the cobbler cool on the counter. The scent filled the room, wrapping her like a blanket. She opened her journal one last time and wrote, "They once mocked my cooking, laughed at my hands, turned away from my table, but I built a new one, and now they come back to sit. Not because they have to, but because they want to. I didn't just become a chef, I became my full self. And that, more than any star, is the real reward." Spring swept into Georgia with a softness. Eleanor hadn't realized she'd missed the scent of honeysuckle floating through open windows, the chatter of birds building nests on porch eaves, and the warmth of sunlit mornings that painted golden patches across her kitchen floor. It had been nearly 3 months since she returned from New York, yet every day still felt like the quiet after a long storm, peaceful but purposeful. She had traded the glare of spotlights for the glow of community, exchanged Michelin scrutiny for the gaze of eager learners who showed up at her barn-turned-kitchen each week, not to become famous, but to reclaim something sacred. The legacy kitchen had become more than a program. It had turned into a revival. Women, widows, grandmothers, retirees, and once overlooked talents gathered from nearby towns and even distant counties. They brought handwritten recipes from mothers and aunties, pickled secrets, and childhood flavors. The barn echoed with laughter, the scrape of knives against cutting boards, the sizzle of pans, and the rhythm of hands kneading, stirring, plating. Eleanor walked among them like a conductor, but with gentleness, always teaching, always learning. Each class began with a story. Food, she would say, is a living memory. When we stop cooking from the heart, we forget who we are. One afternoon, she sat with a woman named Myrtle, 74, who had never cooked for anyone but her husband and children. "I used to think my roast chicken wasn't anything special," Myrtle confessed, "but my grandson cried when I made it for him last Christmas. He said it tasted like Grandma's love." Eleanor placed a hand on hers. "That's not nothing, Myrtle. That's everything." One Sunday morning, Eleanor prepared a community feast. It was her way of giving back to the town that had once watched her fade and now saw her rise. Long wooden tables were placed outside the barn under strings of white lights. Word spread quickly there would be cornbread, candied yams, fried catfish, gumbo, and of course, Eleanor's legendary peach cobbler. By late afternoon, the place buzzed with energy. Families arrived with lawn chairs and mason jars. Children played tag around the magnolia tree. As the sun dipped low, Eleanor stood at the head of the table, flanked by her legacy kitchen students, wearing aprons that proudly read, "Keepers of the Flame." She looked out at the crowd, faces young and old, familiar and new, and felt a swell of something she hadn't even felt in New York. Completeness. I used to cook because I had to, she told the crowd. Then I cooked because I loved to. But now, I cook because I want you to remember your mamas, your grandmamas, the ones who fed you with their hands and healed you with their food. That's the kind of fire we're lighting here. Applause erupted. People wiped tears and dug into their plates with reverence. And then, just as the night was settling into comfort, a black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. Eleanor turned, her breath catching as the back door opened and Jasmine stepped out. Elegant as ever, heels clicking on the stones. Jasmine smiled as she approached, holding out a small paper bag. "Fig jam," she said. "Made it myself. Don't ask for a review, though I'm nowhere near your level." Eleanor embraced her, laughing. "What are you doing here?" "I missed your food," Jasmine said, "and I wanted to see what a revolution looked like up close." They sat together later, under the fairy lights, sipping sweet tea as the crowd slowly thinned. Jasmine looked around, watching as Myrtle taught a group of teenagers how to roll biscuit dough, and Yuki, who had moved from New York to help run the Georgia hits and prepared desert plates with her usual precision. "You've built something eternal," Jasmine said. "This will outlive the fame, the articles, even the restaurant." Eleanor nodded. "I'm not feeding critics anymore. I'm feeding roots." There was a brief pause. "I have news," Jasmine said, pulling out her phone. "I wasn't going to say anything until I saw you, but Eleanor's table just got a second Michelin-Star." Eleanor blinked. "A second?" Jasmine nodded. "Your duck gumbo and that fig-glazed quail redefined what Southern food could be. You're not just making memories, you're making history." Eleanor exhaled slowly, letting the words land where they belonged. "Funny," she said, "that star's shining in New York, but the fire's burning here." The second star didn't change Eleanor's routine. She still rose at dawn, still fed the neighborhood stray cat, still washed her own cast iron pans, but it drew more attention. CNN requested a feature on the legacy kitchen. A Southern cooking documentary team asked her to serve as executive producer. The governor's office invited her to speak about food heritage and rural entrepreneurship. She accepted only what aligned with her mission. "I'm not going back to being a symbol," she told Jasmine. "I'm staying a teacher." One Friday afternoon, as she closed up the barn, she found Marshall waiting on the porch steps with a bouquet of wildflowers and a weathered box in his hands. "I found this in the attic," he said. "It's your old journals. From before all this." Eleanor took the box, heart fluttering. "I thought I'd lost them." Marshall looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't lose anything, Mom. You just gave the world what you always had." They sat together on the steps, Lila joining them soon after, barefoot and glowing. She had spent the day helping in the kitchen, learning how to shell peas and fold pie dough. She was 17 now, wiser, softer. She leaned her head on Eleanor's shoulder and whispered, "I'm thinking of culinary school." Eleanor smiled. "I was thinking of teaching you myself." And so, the cycle continued. In the final week of spring, Eleanor hosted a new kind of dinner, one with no reservations, no menus, no speeches, just an open door. Anyone could walk in, cook, share, eat. Dishes passed from hand to hand. Elders traded recipes with teenagers. A woman from Alabama taught a man from Brooklyn how to stew okra. There were no critics, no cameras, just the symphony of clinking forks and full bellies. Near the end of the night, Eleanor stepped outside for air. The stars above were bright, scattered like sugar on a velvet tablecloth. She looked up at them and thought of her journey. Not the awards or the fame, but the moments when she nearly gave up, when silence hurt more than cruelty, when one dish at a time brought her back to life, and then she laughed. Not the quiet, reserved chuckle she'd become known for, but a deep, joy-filled laugh that rose from her belly and filled the air like a hymn. Because in that moment, Eleanor Hart, once mocked for her cooking, had not only become a Michelin-starred chef, a teacher, a mother, a legacy. She had become a flame that would never go out. The final chapter of Eleanor Hart's journey didn't arrive with fanfare or the clinking of champagne glasses. It arrived quietly, like the soft thud of a pie crust setting on a windowsill, or the whisper of morning light filtering through cotton curtains. It came in the rhythm of familiar footsteps on a wooden floor and the scent of slow-cooked gumbo swirling in a pot that had seasoned itself over generations. By now, Eleanor had grown used to the gentle fame that followed her, like a respectful shadow, but it no longer stirred the urgency it once had. She had become something far deeper than a culinary star. She had become a keeper of stories, a guardian of traditions, and most of all, a woman who had walked back into her own name. The morning of what would become her most memorable Sunday began like many others. Eleanor rose before the sun, tying her apron with the muscle memory of decades, setting her kitchen in order. The oak table was freshly polished, and flowers picked from her garden sat in a glass jar at the center. Wild daisies, sunflowers, and one blooming rose. She moved with grace and calmness, preparing for a special dinner she'd named the Last Supper at home. It was a name not meant in farewell, but in reflection and offering to the life she'd lived before the world came knocking. She had invited Marshall, Kristen, and Lila. They had all agreed to come, albeit cautiously. It would be the first time they'd sat together at her table since that painful night, the night they'd mocked her food, her worth, her place in their lives. Eleanor had not brought it up since. She had nothing left to prove, but she had something to give, a meal crafted with forgiveness, pride, and a quiet kind of triumph. By late afternoon, the house was filled with warmth. In the oven, the roast duck was browning, basted in orange honey glaze. The cornbread had been sliced and was cooling under a cotton cloth. The okra stew simmered gently beside a pot of rice. And on the counter sat Eleanor's now famous peach cobbler, its crust dusted in cinnamon, glistening beneath a lattice of buttery dough. When the knock came, she opened the door with a smile. Marshall stood awkwardly, holding a pie he'd bought from a bakery. Kristen followed behind, visibly unsure, her tone softened by the unknown. Lila stepped in and hugged Eleanor tight, the way a granddaughter clings to the only safe place she's ever known. You look radiant, Lila said, eyes shining. You're just hungry, Eleanor replied, chuckling. They settled around the table, the room bathed in amber light. Eleanor poured sweet tea into mason jars, then ladled gumbo into bowls. The aroma was hypnotic. No one spoke for a while. The food commanded silence. Halfway through the main course, Marshall set down his fork and cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, Mom, he said. His voice was low, hesitant. Actually, more than one. Eleanor looked at him, her face calm, her hands resting gently in her lap. I laughed at you, he continued, dismissed you, mocked your food like it was some joke. I thought the world had passed you by. I didn't know you were waiting for the right time to show it you were still here. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She simply nodded, allowing him the space to sit with his words. Kristen wiped the corner of her mouth with her napkin and offered a fragile smile. I was wrong too, she admitted. Your food, it's extraordinary, but I think what I missed was your strength. I never needed you to believe in me, Eleanor said softly, but I needed you not to break me when I was still finding myself. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was honest. Lila reached for her grandmother's hand. You made the whole world listen, she whispered. Eleanor smiled, but it started with no one listening at all. After the table was cleared, they moved to the porch where fireflies flickered. In the dusk, Eleanor brought out dessert. She served each of them a bowl of peach cobbler, warm and tender, topped with a scoop of homemade vanilla ice cream. The first bite brought tears to Kristen's eyes. I don't know why this makes me want to cry, she said. Because it tastes like forgiveness, Eleanor replied. They stayed late into the night, sipping coffee and sharing stories. New, some old. Marshall spoke of the pressures of fatherhood, of the ways he'd tried to build a life without ever realizing the foundation had been her. Lila spoke of her dreams to travel, to learn, to maybe write a cookbook with her grandmother someday. When they finally stood to leave, Eleanor walked them to the car. She embraced each of them, lingering a little longer with Lila, who whispered, "Don't you ever stop cooking." "I won't," Eleanor promised. After they drove away, Eleanor returned to the porch and looked out over the quiet yard. The barn stood in the distance, softly lit, the kitchen within, now run by the women she had trained. The program had taken on a life of its own. Myrtle had just been interviewed for a local newspaper. Yuki was mentoring her own students. The fire was spreading. Inside the house, Eleanor sat at her table and opened her journal one final time. She had begun this journal the night they first mocked her food. She had filled its pages with hurt, hope, hunger, and healing. Now she had one last entry to make. They mocked my cooking, and I answered not with bitterness, but with butter. Not with anger, but with recipes. They laughed, and I baked. They doubted, and I simmered. They turned away, and I laid the table anyway. I didn't need their validation. I needed my own voice. Tonight, they sat at my table, not because they owed me something, but because they knew deep down they had never really seen me. Now they do. But more importantly, so do I. I am Eleanor Hart, chef, teacher, flamekeeper, and I have only just begun. She set down the pen, closed the journal, and turned off the lamp. The house sighed around her, filled with the silence of peace. In the kitchen, the last warmth of the oven lingered in the air like a blessing. Outside, the stars blinked overhead and caring of Michelin, unaware of critics, but watching, perhaps, as Eleanor Hart, a woman once mocked for her cooking, went to bed knowing she had fed the world more than food. She had fed it truth. She had fed it legacy, and that legacy would rise again, tomorrow, like the smell of fresh cornbread on a spring morning.